Cannibal Island by Nicolas Werth. Death in a Siberian Gulag. Starting on page 116, nearing the end of chapter 4 in the Tomsk transit camp. Rakhametzianov, 12 years old, does not speak Russian, was in transit in Moscow. Her mother left her alone in the situation while she went to try to buy bread. The girl was arrested by police as a young vagabond and deported alone to Narim. Nikolai Yakovlevich Mosaklikin, candidate for membership in the party since 1932, team leader in the kolkhoz of the village of Nunevel Domyi Kolodets in the Belgorod region, sent on a mission by his kolkhoz to buy bread in Moscow, arrested as he got off the train. Had all his certificates in order. The police refused to look at them. Deported to Narim. Galina Georgievna Gorbunova, wife of the reserve commander of the cruiser Aurora, arrested while passing through a Moscow train station on her way home to Leningrad, and while she was pregnant, had with her all her papers and her train ticket for Leningrad, gave birth on the island of Nazino. The arrests immediately followed by deportation could strike as a certain number of examples show those whom Velchenko described as comrades socially close to the Soviet government. Nonetheless, among the persons arrested in and around the train stations, one category was clearly predominant. Peasants fleeing famine who had reached the capital, despite all the obstacles put in their way, ranging from the suspension of railway ticket sales to the deployment of special units of the Ogpuz train station department that were charged with tracking down fugitives spreading rumors about alleged food supply problems. During these months of the famine in the spring of 1933, peasants, whether they arrived alone or with families, were systematically arrested, whether or not they had been officially sent by their kolkhozes, whether or not they had employment contact, whether or not they were supervised by a recruiting agent for a company or a construction project. When they were, Velchenko emphasized it was not rare for the recruiting agent to be arrested and deported along with his men. According to the testimony collected, persons who were arrested spent very little time in the police stations, 24 to 48 hours, before being put without further ado in the Ogpuz convoys headed for Siberia. Poezjait tam s vami razberutsha. Just leave. They'll clear up your case, and out there. That was the standard reply given by police officials to protests by people who had been arrested, who were not even authorized to inform their families or friends if they had any. The police not only paid no attention to documents, attestations, certificates, or union or political party cards when they were presented, but in addition, they frequently confiscated them, no doubt, so that they would not have to give explanations regarding the identity of the déclassé elements arrested and deported, the police force's immediate goal being, as the Kovalev Commission noted, to fill the convoys and to report results in numbers. During the 10-day trip to Tomsk, deportees who had managed to hang on to their papers often lost them to extortion of common criminals who used them to roll their cigarettes. The forced combination of delinquents and or ordinary citizens gave rise to a violent situation in which most inveterates stole from the novices not only their meager rations, 300 grams of bread per day, and nothing more, but also their clothes, their money, their papers. In the convoy that departed Moscow on April 30th, a band of delinquents led by a certain Makoviev, nicknamed Kolka the Sailor, seems to have attacked in particular individuals socially close to the government who had been deported by chance. Kolka the Sailor beat these people with a big stick on which he had carved with his knife. Government decree of August 7, 1932. Several dozen deportees were savagely beaten by this band, whose members were finally arrested on the convoy's arrival in Novosibirsk. In Chelyabinsk, and then in Omsk, the convoy took on several hundred additional detainees, to whom they were added all along the way. A certain number of individuals put in the convoy by chance. According to the testimony collected by the Kovalev Commission, the guards of the Ogpus Transportation Department, who were responsible for escorting the déclassé elements, often resorted to heavy handling tactics. The Commission of Inquiry mentioned as examples of individuals rounded up by chance along the way the following cases. N.S. Skripov was going to the Ichim with his family, but since access to this city has been closed because of an epidemic, he found himself in Omsk. Arrested in the market by guards who were escorting a column of detainees and loaded on the convoy of deportees heading for the transit camp in Tomsk. From there, sent to Nazino. Igor Slowarenko, age 15, apprentice railway worker in Omsk, picked up by chance by the guards of the convoy when the latter stopped in Omsk train station, deported to Nazino. Nikolai Fedorovich Kortyakov, 16, residing in Moscow, returning to Moscow after a visit to his stepfather, I.V. Berezin, a battalion commander stationed in Voynel Poselokok, near Vladivostok, got off the passenger train in the Masalininskia station to look for boiling water to make tea. Arrested by guard of the convoy of deportees coming from Moscow, which had stopped on another track. Put in the convoy by force, deported to Tomsk, then to Nazino. B.F. Oysenko, accountant, residing in Kursk, had taken the train to go to the Golovotino station, but did not awake in time. Seeing the convoy of deportees stopped in the station, he asked the guards to let him ride along with the Golotvino. Having raised his voice, he was immediately arrested, put on the convoy, and deported to the Rym region. B.F. Osenko is a former Red Army volunteer and a reserve officer. When they arrived in Tomsk transit camp on May 10, the déclassé elements from Moscow and Leningrad seemed from the outset, according to the testimony of Kuznetsov, the head of the camp, particularly agitated. On the second night, after the convoy's arrival, disturbances broke out in one of the wooden huts into which several hundred deportees had been crowded. The mounted police were called in. The situation was particularly confused. Kuznetsov acknowledged because camp was plunged into the deepest... Because the camp was plunged into the deepest, darkest, since Siblag had not had the time to install electrical lighting. In the early hours of the morning, guards and representatives of the administration finally managed to gain entry into the hut. In fact, all the deportees were demanding was water. For 2 days, they had not received any water, and they all had to eat, and all they had to eat was a little bread and salt fish. Just to throw this in there, they used to do this where they would give them salt fish as a cruel joke, because if you eat salt fish, you get really thirsty, and being thirsty without food is without water is really, really a fucked up way to torture somebody, but they did that all the time. Also, thank you guys for watching on Instagram. If you want to continue watching this after the whole thing ends, usually Instagram cuts me off after an hour, I encourage you to hop over to my Periscope. The link to that is in the bio of my Instagram description. Anyway, continuing. For 2 days, they had not received any water, and all they had to eat was a little bread and salt fish. According to Sokolov, the Siblag's chief assistant, the disturbances were in fact caused by something far more serious. The guards had opened fire on deportees who were trying to escape from the hut. The day before, Kuznetsov had taken away 7 socially dangerous elements and ringleaders, pretended to execute them, and let it be known that any other troublemakers would meet the same fate. The situation remained explosive. With its 25,000 deportees, a third of whom were classified as urban déclassés and socially dangerous elements, the Tomsk transit camp seemed to both the city authorities and the leaders of the Siblag to be a real powder keg, especially since, according to the plan distributed to the camp authorities, some 350,000 deportees were supposed to pass through it in 3 months, with 4,000 being dispatched daily to the commandanturas in the Narim region. Since the degree of congestion in the camp was becoming catastrophic, getting rid of the most troubled contingent seemed the highest priority. It was in these circumstances that, on May 14th, 1933, several thousand elements were hastily put on barges, headed for the Alexandro-Volkovskaya Kommandantura. It's the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, Nazino. On May 5, 1933, Sepkov, the commander of the Alexandro-Volkovskaya Kommandantura, received 2 telegrams. One was from the Siblag leadership, informing him that he must be prepared to receive as soon as navigation conditions permit 3,000 déclassés elements arriving from Tomsk. The second, which came from Tomsk transit camp, confirmed this information, but gave still a higher figure, on the order of 5,000 to 6,000 elements. Taken completely by surprise, as he himself said, Sepkov first called a meeting of the Kommandantura's few officials. Each one said that nothing was ready, since the deportees had not been expected to arrive before the end of June. Moreover, up to that point, the Siblag had never said that it would be sending a massive number of deportees, consisting exclusively of urban déclassé elements, to the Alexandro-Volkovskaya Kommandantura. Thus, they had been expecting to have to deal with the usual contingents of kulaks and a few urban elements. In addition, they had still received no word regarding the boats that had been promised by the Rektrans for transporting the deportees up to the Ob's tributaries to their settlement sites. The construction of a central bread bakery in the town of Alexandrovskoye was stalled. Food stocks were at their lowest point because the ice breakup on the river had just begun, and for months no river boats had been able to come up to the Ob. Other stocks, particularly manufactured goods, were virtually non-existent. In all, there were only 30 pairs of men's trousers, 6 sheets of tin plate, enough to make 24 pails, and a few hundred pairs of lapti, hemp boots. Sepkov immediately sent a telegram to the Siblag leadership, explaining that it would be several weeks before he would be able to receive the deportees. He was wasting his time. The same evening, Novosibirsk indicated that the dispatch of contingents was now the province of the authorities at the Tomsk transit camp, which was very congested, and that Sepkov had to conform to Kuznetsov's dispatching plans. The commander then asked the help of the party's district committee. Vlasov, the secretary of the Alexandrovskoye district, called an emergency meeting. There could be no question of contesting the Siblag's decision. Since a party member transmitted to the Siblag's directive to us, the latter is party directive, and thus, as communists, we have to carry it out, Vlasov explained. There was a discussion regarding the place where the déclassé elements should be disembarked. This contingent was particularly troubling for local officials who had little familiarity with this kind of group. It was the first time I had to deal with that kind of group, Sepkov explained before the Commission of Inquiry. I've always worked in the countryside. I got to know the kulak. I was perfectly acquainted with the mozik. I admit that when I found out that I would have to deal with socially harmful elements coming from the cities, I panicked. However, Sepkov added, he was not the only one. Everyone agreed that we couldn't unload these elements in either Alexandrovskoye or near the village where the former kulaks and ostyaks had already settled. If we did that, all hell would break loose. It would be the end of collectivization cooperatives and the ostyaks. They would steal everything, pillage everything, and massacre the local people. Hence, it was decided, according to Sepkov, to unload the déclassé elements on an island in the middle of the Ob, located opposite the village of Nazino, 70 kilometers upstream from Alexandrovskoye. From there, they would be taken by boat in scattered groups to their final place of settlement, far from any inhabited area along the Nazino River, one of the Ob's numerous tributaries. Sepkov's version was contested by Vlasov, who stated before the Commission of Inquiry that after an animated discussion, the party district committee finally decided to unload the deportees near the village of Proletarka. Thus, it was Sepkov, the party's directives, to disembark the deportees on the island of Nazino. The question of how to transport and supply the deportees were also discussed at this meeting. Since the Kommandantura lacked everything, it was decided to ask all the kolkhozes, rural Soviets, and other economic organizations in the district to provide within 2 weeks hatchets, saws, shovels, and other tools needed to enable the new contingents to build shelters and to mobilize all available motorboats, rowboats, to carry the deportees from the point where they were all taken off the larger river boats to their settlement sites. The executive committee of the Soviets was asked to make available to the commander Sepkov the food, stocks, and cooperative storehouses on the express condition that he will promptly replenish the quantities allocated. Finally, in order to prevent mass escapes and the inevitable increase in thefts that usually follows the unloading of such a large number of déclassés, the local authorities were called upon to strengthen the population's vigilance and capacity for self-defense, to organize night patrols, and to do everything possible to arrest the fugitives. These fighting words remained largely just that, words. The kolkhozis were struggling along with barely enough means of production to survive, and they lacked food supplies. For the past 2 years, food shortages had been an endemic everywhere in the Narim region. In the meantime, 900 kilometers away, the authorities in Tomsk transit camp were hastily preparing to send on the déclassé elements from Moscow and Leningrad. Before May 15th, 16,000 deportees coming from Ukraine and the North Caucasus were expected in addition to the approximately 25,000 deportees already in the camp. I had to receive 2, sometimes 3 convoys a day, and to send out the same number, Kuznetsov, the head of the camp, told the Commission of Inquiry. That's why I was unable to supervise in detail the sending out of all 4 barges full of deportees on May 14th. All the camp's officials were overworked. A certain Kolobyev, who had been recommended by the party's committee of Tomsk, but had no experience working with special settlers, was asked to supervise the operations of loading and convoying some 5,000 elements as far as the Alexandrov-Volkovskaya Kommandantura. The Rektrans made available to the camp 4 barges that were normally used for transporting wood and were completely unsuited for conveying thousands of persons. The sole adaptation made for the purpose was hastily constructed barrier to separate the men from the women. Since the contingent was considered particularly dangerous and likely to try and escape, Kolobyev was ordered not to stop for any reason during the 5 or 6 day trip up the river to the debarkation point. All the deportees were crowded below decks with no opportunity to go on deck, so that on arrival, many of the people, completely overwhelmed by the pure air of the taiga, fainted, whereas hundreds of others who were unable to move had to be pulled out onto the riverbank. To feed the deportees en route, Sepkov gave them prescribed ration, 5 days' worth of bread at a rate of 200 grams per person, plus, he claimed, enough flour, salt, sugar, and dried fish for a month. In reality, as came out in the contradictory testimony collected by the Commission of Inquiry, the provisions taken on board in addition to the prescribed ration of bread consisted in no more than a few sacks of semolina sugar and salt, along with 20 tons of flour, or 4 kilos per person, enough to last 10 days, but only if the flour was made into bread. However, the barges being overloaded, nothing else was taken along. No cooking utensils, dishes, bowls, or tools that might have enabled the deportees to make food for themselves or set up rudimentary shelters. Questioned regarding this thoughtless dispatch of thin, ragged, poorly clothed, nearly shoeless individuals with not even a bowl to eat in, not even a cup or a spoon, Kuznetsov reported, "I was convinced that the commanders to whom we were sending this contingent were properly prepared to receive it, since they had received all the necessary instructions during the meeting that had been held in March. Moreover, I had gone beyond the norm. I would certainly have been accused of sabotage, or more likely of yielding to the citizens of success. Finally, I had been told by the leadership that if the deportees were not correctly clothed, if they had not brought along with them the 50 to 100 kilos to which they had a right under the regulations, it was not up to the Siblag to provide them with clothing or provisions." Again, in accord with the hygienic norms relating to the conveying of special settlers. A physician and 2 health officers, equipped with 5 small rural pharmaceutical kits, were assigned to the convoy. A final, particularly delicate point remained to be dealt with. There was a desperate lack of guards to escort these thousands of déclassé elements. For the usual convoys of kulaks, deported along with their families, the prescribed norm was 1 guard for every 100 families. For the urban déclassés, the norm was 1 guard for every 100 individuals. Finding some 50 guards to escort the May 14 convoy proved a difficult task, and the authorities ended up recruiting poor, unemployed wretches who had been wandering the streets of Tomsk. As Sepkov said in his deposition, these people, who had neither shoes nor uniforms, were in no way distinguished from the déclassé elements they were supposed to monitor. They had neither the authority nor the discipline. If they gave an order, no one listened to them. "Look at yourself. You're no different from me," the elements replied. When I gave them an order, they ignored me. We had hardly arrived in Nazino before most of them told me that they wanted to go back to Tomsk because they had been tricked. When they were recruited, they had been promised that the Kommandantura would take care of them, give them a uniform, shoes, and lodging in Alexandrovskoye. However, all they got was an old rifle, and then they were sent into the taiga to have the people graze, as they called it. Under such conditions, it is surprising that most of these guards stole from the deportees and subjected to them to every conceivable or imaginable kind of extortion. Wait, under such conditions, is it surprising that most of these guards stole from the deportees and subjected to them every conceivable or imaginable kind of extortion? In addition to the 50 or so guards, the Siblag sent 2 newly recruited commanders to the special villages under orders to help Kolobiev, the head of the convoy, and to back up the little team at the Alexandro Vakovskoye Kommandantura. At 5 p.m. on May 15th, Sepkov received a telegram from Kuznetsov informing him that the day before he had sent him 2 convoys of 4 barges with 4,900 déclassés on board. These convoys arrived at the Verknevorotskov pier on May 18. There, Kuznetsov was supposed to handle the operations and unload the deportees. At the planned settlement sites, did the head of the Tomsk camp know exactly where the deportees were going to be set ashore and under what conditions? In his deposition before the commission, he asserted that he did not. Sepkov had telegraphed him to say that the place of debarkation would be between the villages of Nazino and Proletarka, without specifying the precise site. According to Kuznetsov, Sepkov had not properly informed him of the state of complete unpreparedness. Sepkov had transmitted his grievances directly to his superiors in Novosibirsk, and they had not forwarded them. All in all, a fairly common situation. Despite all the plans the settlers of the deportees had always been carried out, in the end, nakuda, on the spur of the moment, without preparation. Traveling upstream against the current on the only usable motorboat, the Kommandantura had at the time accompanied by 2 assistants and 3 guards. It took Sepkov 3 days to cover the 150 kilometers separating Alexandrovskoye from Verkhny Vorkzov. When he arrived there, he took over the direction of the operations and had the convoys land several dozen kilometers downstream. on a deserted island in the middle of the Ob. This island was 3 kilometers long and some 500 to 600 meters wide, and was situated across the river from the little village of Nazino, where a few special settler families and a dozen Ostraic families lived. Like most of the islands in the Ob, which were more than 2 kilometers wide at this point, it was flooded at times of high water and offered only inhospitable expanse of the swamps and poplar groves. We have several accounts which corroborate each other to a remarkable extent regarding the debarkation of some 5,000 declasse elements on the island of Nazino on this afternoon of May 18th, 1933. These accounts enable us to reconstruct the scene. Until nightfall, Sepkov, his assistant in charge of accounting, Kiselev, and Kolobiev, the head of the convoy, kept busy for hours trying to count the deportees and perform a roll call. An impossible task. The lists, written in pencil on wrapping paper, were for the most part illegible. In addition, the number of individuals they mentioned, 5,318, differed both from the number of passengers registered on the departure that Kuznetsov had communicated, 4,900, and from the number 5,000 telegraphed to Sepkov by the Siblag's Department of Special Settlements. As it was getting dark, and the captain of the river convoys was threatening to demand a supplementary payment for immobilizing his boats if he was late in leaving for Tomsk, Sepkov decided not to do an individual roll call and to limit himself to counting the persons unloaded. The women were made to disembark first. There were 322 of them. And then the men, whose numbered 4,556. 27 bodies of deportees who had died during the transfer from Tomsk were also unloaded. As all of the witnesses acknowledged, a very large number of deportees, at least a third, were so emaciated and weak that they were no longer able to stand. Sepkov ordered several dozen of the more able-bodied deportees to get the weaker ones out of the hold. In his deposition, the commander did not conceal his stupefaction It's a tough one. To get the weaker ones out of the hold. In his deposition, the commander did not conceal his stupefaction on the first seeing this contingent. I've never lived in the city. I had no idea what these criminal and urban declasse elements were like. I'd imagine they would be very different from these injured and ill people. These poor wretches with deathly pale faces, most of them in rags. A few dressed in the city clothes, with shoes and a coat, but all of them without even a bag. Even the good old big canvas bag in which a peasant always succeeds in slipping some tool, a kettle, a knife, a cup, a piece of lard. All these people got off the boat, if they could still stand up, with nothing, without any provisions at all, empty-handed. Once the deportees had been set down on the island, Sepkov ordered the 20 tons of flour unloaded. A fight broke out while the sacks of flour were being unloaded, and the guards opened fire, wounding several persons. After this incident, Sepkov ordered the convoy to cast off and unload the stocks on the other side of the river in Nazino, where they would be protected from any attack, but not from the damp and the cold. In fact, because there were not enough sacks, a product always in short supply, a large portion of the flour loaded on the barges had been directly poured into sandbags that were deposited, not without difficulty, directly on the earth. The local inhabitants were stupefied by this mountain of abundance, which was soon covered with snow. For a few hours after the boats were unloaded, a snowstorm began. This seriously aggravated the situation of thousands of starving and chilled deportees who began to light wood fires in the hope of warming themselves. The next morning, on an island covered by a thin blanket of spring snow and the thick smoke from dozens of wood fires burning in the ambient dampness, Sepkov, accompanied by his assistants, the three health officers, and two new commanders who had arrived from Tomsk, tried to organize an initial distribution of the flour. At the rate of 1 pound per person, no other foodstuff being available. Most of the deportees, having no cup, tumbler, or any other container into which the precious ration could be put, the luckiest held out their fur hats and others their shoes or coat tails, while the most deprived had nothing but their 2 hands to receive the prescribed measure. After 2 hours, the distribution that the officials had tried to organize, despite the approximately 5,000 mouths to be fed, by handing out the provisions to individuals, one by one, according to their place in line, degenerated into a disorderly scramble. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, on this point, the testimony differed, of deportees were trampled once again. Once again, the guards, overwhelmed, opened fire, wounding several persons. Sepkov had the distribution halted and announced new rules, which were to prove catastrophic for a number of the deportees, especially the weakest and least able to fight for survival. This distribution would henceforth be made by brigadiers, who would receive daily from the administration a ration of 75 kilos for 150 persons. This system led to the greatest abuses since a minority of criminals, more ruthless than the others, immediately monopolized the positions of brigadiers and the operations of distribution. After the morning's incidents, Sepkov tried to put together 2 teams of deportees who knew how to construct primitive clay ovens for baking bread, like the ones peasants built in the countryside. About 30 volunteers were taken, under close escort, to Nazino. However, this experiment did not succeed, because the earth was frozen below the surface. The volunteers were not able to dig deep enough. The small amount of clay they had found was of poor quality, and especially, according to Sepkov, the declasse elements all claimed to know all sorts of trades, but when they were put to work, they didn't know how to do anything, and especially not how to build bread ovens. On the island, the dead were piling up. In the mission report, Kolobiev, the head of the convoy, submitted on his return to Tomsk, he wrote, "At 2 p.m. on May 20, I went to the island of Nazino with Commander Sepkov. There was a terrible scramble, people crowding and fighting around bags of flour, dead bodies everywhere, 100 or more, and lots of people crawling about and crying, 'Give us bread, boss, it's been 2 days since we've been given anything to eat. They're trying to make us die of hunger and the cold.' They told us that people had begun eating the dead bodies, that they were cooking human flesh. The scene on the island was dreadful, appalling. When we got back to the village of Nazino, we gathered together all the assistant commanders and the health personnel, barely a dozen persons in all. It was decided, 1. To set up a few tents to shelter the most sick. 2. To mobilize the local population to construct ovens. 3. To requisition all the ovens of the inhabitants of the village of Nazino, 10 to 12 homes. Have thus completed my mission, I left for Tomsk with the convoy at 3 a.m. on May 21. Confronted by growing chaos, Sepkov decided to go to see what he could find in the way of food supplies and equipment in Alexandrovskoye, delegating his powers to Chikalov and Sulaimanov, the two commanders who had come from Tomsk. Over the next few days, the situation on the island grew steadily worse. Apart from a few dozen fortunate invalids who had been put into 4 tents set up by the health officers, into whom bread and semolina soup were distributed, the immense majority of the deportees had to get along on a ration of 1 pound of flour a day, mixed with a little river water, which immediately caused serious intestinal disturbances. The ration was, moreover, purely theoretical, since many deportees received nothing at all after the distribution was taken over by the gangsters and the guards. The latter differing from the former only because they carried firearms. To get their rations, as small as it might be, deportees who still had a few warm clothes, an overcoat, or a pair of shoes had to give them up in exchange for a piece of bread or a pound of flour. According to testimony collected by Velchenko, in the primitive socialist economy that rapidly established itself on the island, a pair of shoes was worth 3 1-kilo loaves of bread, or 4 or 5 salt fish, and an overcoat could be exchanged for 2-kilo loaf of bread. A package of tobacco or 2 gold dental crowns. This is so fucked up. They're pulling their own gold teeth to give criminals for bread. My only interjection, just saying, it's fucked up. In his account, already quoted, Ivan Ionovich Alvarov refers to other equivalencies current on Nazino. 1 gold crown for a box of matches or a newspaper, used mainly for rolling cigarettes. The practice of extracting gold crowns from the jawbones of cadavers is mentioned as early as May 23rd in the first report submitted by the physician and the 2 health officers in charge of the sanitary situation on the island. As more and more deportees died, this practice turned into a regular business that left a lasting impression on people's minds because it marked a major transgression against the respect due to the dead. These gold crowns immediately found buyers among the traffickers and gold traders of the Russian Far East. They were resold, usually illicitly, to the cooperatives of the Torgskin network in exchange for products that were in short supply and were particularly prized. The guards' activities were not limited, alas, to experimenting with the implementation of a primitive socialist economy. Using and abusing their power, the armed guards instituted a reign of arbitrariness and terror, and did not hesitate to summarily execute deportees who had cheated during the distribution of food, or to kill in order to steal an overcoat or a pair of shoes. In this respect, the wealthiest deportees from Moscow and Leningrad, who had been arrested and deported as a result of some unfortunate chance, seem to have also been the most vulnerable. Although the jackets, overcoats, or shoes they wore could serve as money, allowing them to obtain a bit of food, this convected merchandise could also, this coveted merchandise could also get its owner attacked and killed, as is shown by numerous examples cited by the Commission of Inquiry. If the guards committed the most widespread and most murderous atrocities, Chikalev, Solmanov, and a half-dozen other commanders in the neighboring special villages who were called upon to help committed their share as well. The Commission of Inquiry's report cited some of the atrocities committed by the supervisory staff. So this is a few noted accounts of some fucked up things that these people from the nearby village that were hired by the operators of this have done. Volosenko, commander of the village of Nazino, blows and injuries systematically inflicted on special settlers, systematic non-distribution of provisions, deportees who did not know how to swim were thrown overboard and drowned. Sarapkin, commander of the village of Prolatarka, amused himself by having special settlers row the boats. Those who rowed badly were thrown in the water. Several deportees drowned in this way. Kokolov, manager of the cooperative storehouse in Nazino, systematically beat special settlers with a stick, extorted clothing from them by promising them better rations, forced special settlers to leap into the freezing water on the river to fetch the water birds he had shot. Chikalov, commander of the island of Nazino, set an example by systematically beating with a stick special settlers who fell into his hands and indulging in speculation and trafficking in clothing stolen from special settlers and in gold crowns taken from the mouths of the dead. Sulyamonov, commander of the island of Nazino, beat special settlers with a stick, used them as oarsmen when he went fishing, behaved inappropriately with regard to individuals who were starving. You can only imagine what that means. In his letter to Stalin, Valchenko provides some illuminating details concerning the inappropriate behavior on the commander Suomanov's part that was singled out for the criticism by the Commission of Inquiry. In front of starving deportees awaiting their meager ration of flour, he ostentatiously ate huge quantities of sugar, to the point that, as he himself said, he completely lost his taste for it. This kind of abuse on the part of the supervisory staff, which was qualified by the Commission of Inquiry as siege-neutral behavior, was in reality, as it's shown by the numerous administrative reports concerning everyday life in these special villages, very widespread among the little bosses of the commandanturas, and even among the local communist officials who had constituted a new stratum of Soviet serfs, who were prompt to parody the stereotypical behavior that the state that arose out of the October Revolution attributed to the overthrown former masters. However, the most serious facts that came to light concerned the murder of deportees, who were shot as in hunting, a practice that was, as we have seen, far from exceptional in the commandanturas of the Narim region. In their defense, the guards and commanders implicated by the Commission of Inquiry referred to the orders Sepkov had given to immediately fire on anyone trying to escape. And in fact, It seems that many deportees did try to flee on small, primitive rafts. At first, one official explained, "We didn't think anyone could escape from the island of Nazino. The current was very strong, the water freezing cold, and the river was several kilometers wide. Without tools, they couldn't build a boat. But a certain number of criminal and déclassé elements showed a great ingenuity by tying large, dry branches together. They were able to make a sort of primitive raft that could carry 3 or 4 people. Then they let the current carry them along. A persistent rumor was going around to the effect that about 60 kilometers downstream there was a railway line that would enable them to get back to Novosibirsk. Naturally, the fugitives have very little chance of surviving. Most of them drowned or died of hunger. We found, for dozens of kilometers downstream, hundreds of bodies that had washed up on the banks of the Ob. For the Chekist officials, the fugitives, criminal and déclassé elements, were dangerous individuals who had to be eliminated for at least 2 reasons. They were likely to join, as other fugitives had already done, the criminal bands of bandits still active in the Narim region, and, in addition, some of them were particularly degenerate individuals. In short, cannibals. Strange things are happening in Russia. Famine, cannibalism, people arriving from the provinces tell odd stories. Nina Lagozakaya, a young student in Moscow who came from a well-off family of the city's intelligentsia, wrote in her diary. At the time, the Ogpu's postal censors were confiscating thousands of letters from Ukraine peasants, describing in detail the effects of the famine and the spread of the anthropophagy in the countryside. A few months earlier, in Kemerovo, a major mining center in Kuzbas, some 200 kilometers south of Tomsk, hundreds of Kazakhs fleeing famine had been lynched because of rumors accused them of kidnapping Russian children in order to eat them. In 1933, the USSR was buzzing with rumors of cannibalism. In the areas where famines were most severe, these rumors were sometimes not unfounded. And even when they were unfounded, they were nonetheless, to use Mark Bloch's fine formulation, the minor in which the collective consciousness looks at its own face. The mirror. And even when they were unfounded, they were nonetheless, to use Mark Bloch's fine formulation, the mirror in which the collective consciousness looks at its own face. Despite the prohibition on looking at it, one is tempted to add in the specific case of the USSR in the early 1930s. In fact, perhaps even more than famine, which was unthinkable in the country of socialism, anthropophagy remained the taboo subject par excellence. The confidential instructions given by the Ogpu's Department of Information, which was asked to look into the reactions of the population with respect to rumors about existence of problems with food supplies, are very explicit on this point. But it was, nonetheless, on everyone's mind. On the island of Nazino, the first rumors about bodies cut up and human flesh cooked and eaten began to appear the day after the deportees were unloaded there. 3 days later, on May 23rd, the 3 health officers on the island wrote the first report on the situation on Nazino, which they submitted to the Siblog's Department of Special Settlements. After describing the conditions under which the deportees had been received, on the island, they alerted their superiors to the looming threat of a typhus epidemic. 5 suspected cases had already been seen, but the bulk of the report deals with the rapidly rising mortality rate due to dysentery resulting from eating flour mixed with river water, and to the generally weakened condition connected with weeks of insufficient nutrition. The deportees had not had any hot food since being arrested in Moscow or Leningrad. On May 21 alone, the 3 health officers counted 70 additional dead bodies. In 5 cases, they emphasized the liver, the heart, the lungs, and fleshy parts of the bodies, breasts, calves, had been cut off. On one of the bodies, the head had been torn off, along with the male genital organs and part of the skin. These mutilations constitute strong evidence of cannibalistic acts. In addition, they suggest the existence of serious psychopathologies. On the same day, May 21, the deportees themselves brought us 3 individuals who had been caught with blood on their hands and holding human livers. Our examination of these 3 individuals did not reveal any extreme emaciation, but rather external signs of degeneracy. These individuals were immediately turned over to the head of the guard. In the course of the following weeks, the same health officers on the island submitted 3 additional reports describing analogous cases. In all, several dozen bodies found with the liver, heart, and lungs cut out. According to the doctors, the guards and commanders had hardly reacted, at least during the first days afterward, or taken any steps to isolate the individuals caught in possession of human flesh, or in the act of eating it. Most of these individuals were released, since it had not been established that they had killed the person whose body parts they had eaten, and since the Soviet Penal Code does not prescribe a penalty for necrophagy. However, the first case, in which murder followed by acts of cannibalism was proven, was recorded only on May 29. The 3 guilty persons, young habitual criminals ranging in age from 20 to 25, were arrested and taken to prison in Alexandrovskoye. 3 other cannibals were arrested on May 31. They admitted having killed a young man and eaten his liver and kidneys. Visibly upset by this event, local officials tried at first to minimize and trivialize it. In his report to the regional committee of the party in Narim, Vlasov, the party's district secretary, who had arrived on site May 31, devoted barely 3 lines to the subject. About a dozen cases of cannibalism had been noted. According to physicians, the individuals who committed these acts of cannibalism were not completed, emaciated, and starving. They indulged in cannibalism by habit because they had been cannibals for a long time. Cannibalism by habit. This astonishing explanation is also found in the deposition of Semernev, and other local official questioned by the Commission of Inquiry. But it is found as well in the juicy neologism coined by the health officer Katskelevich, an official at the Alexandro Vakhovskaya Kommandantura, who explained these acts of cannibalism as resulting from anism, a term borrowed as such and without any reservations by Ivan Dolgoik, the head of the Special Settlements Department, in the report he wrote on the Nazino affair for submissions to Alexandra Gorchkov, the head of the Siblag. In referring to cannibalism by habit, the officials of the Gulag were certainly thinking of practice that was widespread in the particularly ruthless world of a hardened criminals, that of bleeding the cow in the argot of the underworld. Jacques Rossi explains in his Manual des Gulag, the cow is a novice whom the ex-convicts ask to join them in attempting to escape. In general, the novice is flattered to find himself associating with famous criminals. However, he does not know that if they run short of food, he will be killed, and his kidneys and his blood eaten, usually raw, by the fugitives not daring to light a fire for fear of being spotted. In the camps and prisons, cow-eaters are called cannibals. Cannibalism is not peculiar to the Soviet period. Under the Tsars, a certain V. Vasilyev escaped from jail along with another prisoner. Before being caught, he had eaten his companion's flesh, but it was not until the establishment of the Soviet system that the phenomenon, which had become fairly frequent, gave rise to a series of specific slang terms: the cow, synonyms, the baggage, the ram, the lamb. Several of the guards, indicted by the Commission of Inquiry for having killed with rifles, as if they were hunting deportees who were trying to escape on improvised rafts, argued in their own defense that a number of these deportees, who had left in groups of 3 or 4, were certainly cannibals, taking along their cow. Thus we see, emerging in the minds of the officials and low-level staff, a first explanation of the acts of cannibalism committed on Nazino. The testimonies collected in the late 1980s in Nazino and neighboring villages included other particularly striking images that suggest acts different from those associated with the practice, fairly well attested in the criminal underworld of bleeding the cow. Thus, 4 remarkably concordant testimonies mention several cases of women being savagely attacked by cannibals who cut off their breasts or calves. Some of them survived, whereas others died of their wounds, and still others went mad. After these particularly traumatic attacks, 2 of the testimonies mentioned in particular the case of the wife of a communist leader who had been rounded up by chance in Moscow, deported to Tomsk, and then to Nazino, and whom criminal elements tortured by cutting off her breasts. It was following this precise case that a commission of leaders is supposed to have finally been sent to Nazino to look into the cases of cannibalism. It has not been proven possible to determine the identity of this wife of the communist leader, whose memory remained so vivid in the memories of the local residents. On the other hand, we do have a record of the meeting held on June 21 by a commission headed by Ivan Dolgoik and composed of Siblag officials that arrived on site more than 1 month after the déclassé and criminal elements were set down on the island of Nazino. In the passage of this commission's report relating to cannibalism, we find no explicit reference to the case of the wife of the communist leader. On the contrary, the Siblag officials sought to minimize the phenomenon of cannibalism, while at the same time giving it a political bent. Note that the rumors regarding cases of cannibalism systematically spread by the déclassés themselves are without foundation. These rumors obviously have been political implications. As is shown by certain particular circumstances, they are supposed to emphasize that this this aspect. Commander Sepkov did not show Bolshevist vigilance in this regard. He did not locate the source of these rumors, did not expose the investigators, even though the latter were trying to turn the minds of the déclassé elements in a clearly anti-Soviet direction. In the strictly confidential report, also already cited, that Ivan Dolgoyuk submitted to the leadership of the Siblag, the head of the Special Settlements Department developed a very political interpretation of the phenomenon of cannibalism. He tried to demonstrate that hunger cannot be the origin of these acts, given that most of the cases of cannibalism occurred at the time when the problem of provisions was being resolved. None of the cannibals caught showed signs of pronounced emaciation. Several of them admitted that in the past they had already eaten human flesh. However, Dolgoyuk did not accept autonism, the neologism adapted by the head of the Siblag, as the main explanation of the cannibalism, even if, he added, a certain number of party officials have lined up behind the argument. According to Dolgoyuk, the acts of cannibalism were often accompanied by sadism, resulted in reality from a peculiar combination of individuals, degeneracy, and a very well-defined political intentions. Among the latter was an attitude of defiance with regard to the Soviet regime, a defiance that a criminal element speaking to head of the Siblag Special Settlements Department had put this way: "You're starving the people. Well, we're eating each other." Cannibalism as a defiant response to the extreme violence practiced by a state that was starving people obviously constituted, in the eyes of the Chekist officials, an unacceptably seditious notion. "I ordered the immediate arrests of this individual for counter-revolutionary propaganda," Dolgoyuk reported. During his brief stay in Nazino, he caused to be arrested about 15 ringleaders who were making counter-revolutionary statements and smudgingly spreading allegations regarding cannibalism and a famine allegedly organized by the Soviet state. According to Dolgoyuk, the rumors were relayed by a certain number of political exiles who had come specially to the village of Nazino in order to establish contacts with déclassé elements. All of this, he concluded, clearly demonstrates a political manipulation directed by outside elements. Precisely how widespread was cannibalism in Nazino? Even if it left an indelible impression to which the well-arrested... Precisely how widespread was cannibalism in Nazino? Well, even if it left an indelible impression to which the well-attested nickname Cannibal Island bears witness, the number of proven cases of cannibalism and necrophagy was not more than a few dozen. About 50 persons suspected of having eaten human flesh were arrested, but many of them were quickly released, given the very fragmentary evidence we have regarding the identity of these individuals. It would be risky to draw any conclusions about the typical profile of the Nazino cannibal. Here, we will limit ourselves to emphasize that all the anthropophagy were men, most of whom were young, had been born in the countryside, and had already been found guilty of crimes at least once, and had already done time in a camp or in a prison. 11 cannibals were sentenced to death by a special Ogpu panel, specifically set up in July 1933 for the purpose of liquidating criminal activity in the Narim region. These sentences were handed down after the Ogpu's plenipotentiary representative personally personally intervened to overturn the decision made by the Narim region's prosecutor not to be prosecuted the individuals accused of necrophagy, on the ground that eating human flesh is not subject to penalty in the Soviet Penal Code, and the material conditions into which the labor colonists deported to the island of Nazino had been put were particularly difficult. According to Ivan Alvarov's testimony, the people who were eating human flesh were well aware that they could do so with impunity, as long as it had not proven that they had previously murdered the victim. As for spending a few months in prison while awaiting the investigation of his case, that meant, according to one of the cannibals arrested, at least a guaranteed roof over your head and a bowl of hot balanda, a broth served in prison camps, instead of freezing to death and having to eat flour mixed with river water. The dramatic situation on the island of Nazino was still further aggravated on May 27, with the arrival of a new convoy of declasse elements sent out from transit camp a week earlier. Even before Kolobiev, the official in charge of the first two convoys, had returned to Tomsk, obviously the camp's authorities had not been informed of what was happening 900 kilometers down the stream, and had continued to decongest the camp at the rate of 3,000 to 4,000 individuals a day, sent to the various commandanturas in the Narim region. On the evening of May 27, about 1,200 declasse elements were crowded in to the hold of a barge and sent over to the island of Nazino, under approximately the same conditions as the 5,000 or so who had been sent earlier. According to the doctors on site, the second group was in even more degraded state of health than the first. A certain number of them suffering from typhus. It was decided to quarantine the sick on a part of the island, but everything was lacking. There were only 6 tents and no medicines or even containers for boiling water. In order to disinfect the clothing of the contaminated individuals, in any case, the physicians wrote in their report, the deportees' rags would not have survived any washing, and we would have found ourselves with totally naked individuals, while every night the temperature drops below freezing. Like the contingents unloaded on May 18th, the new arrivals received nothing to eat but a little flour, bread being reserved for the sickest among them. Accompanied by Vlasov, the secretary of the Communist Party organization in the Alexandrovskoye district, Commander Sepkov returned to Nazino on May 31, after more than a week's absence. In the interim, an emergency meeting of the office of the district committee of the party had been called into the Commandantura's administrative center to decide what to do about the declasse elements who had been unloaded on the island of Nazino. You know what? I think that's a good cliffhanger to stop for today. This chapter's still got about 50 pages. I think I'll keep you guys on the tippy toes of your feet and the edge of your seat, and we're going to stop right here. But yeah, so let's do a quick overview. Basically, things are getting really shitty. People are eating each other. People are abusing power, which is human nature. Yeah, I mean, the only food these people have is flour that it's being dumped in sandbags on the front of the island that they have to mix. So the whole point was to have bread, but like they don't have bread. They have materials that bread is supposed to be made. It's always with socialism and communism, this kind of stuff. It's always like, yeah, you know, we can do this. It's like a math equation, but they don't realize that like no one's good at math. So they end up at the island with flour. I don't even think they have water. I think they just fucked on that part. But yeah, these people are mixing flour with river water to try and eat it. Like, it's not even bread. They couldn't. They took everyone's word for like being knowledgeable about making a clay oven, but then when they actually got to the point where it's like, all right, we have to make 12 clay ovens for everyone to survive, they're like, actually, I kind of just made that up. I don't really know what I'm doing, and yeah, so they. It's just so stupid. Anyway, this has been Cannibal Island, the end of Chapter 4 and the beginning of Chapter 5, and mostly Chapter 5. But, yeah, hey, by the way, I'm getting to the end of this book, and what I'm doing is I'm making an audiobook. So I'm recording, you can see 2 microphones here. One is going directly into Pro Tools, and one is going into like the phones and the video and everything. So with the one going into Pro Tools, I'm going to cut out all the like breaths and blank spaces and mispronunciations of extremely tough Russian words that I can't say right now. And I'm going to, you know, put it into a perfect like 8-hour audiobook for you guys to listen to for free, or for anyone who wants to listen to that. But I'm going to continue reading things live during this quarantine because, like, what else is there to do? And I feel like it's a good way to feel like there are people around you and stuff. So if you have any suggestions of, like, books you want to hear read, then feel free to DM me. And definitely follow me on Periscope, because the Instagram, it's not reliable. It's basically just there for, you know, to get you to follow me on Periscope so you can actually hear all these. And if you're someone who's just tuning in today, definitely go check out the YouTube channel or the Periscope. The YouTube has all the videos like Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, etc. So you can catch up if you feel like spending a whole night doing it. You could catch up to what we've done so far. And then tomorrow when I start Chapter 5, or when I start halfway through Chapter 5, then you'll be as if like you had already been there. So anyway, follow me on Periscope, send me some book ideas so we can read something else next week, and yeah, check Audible for a book that you want to hear, and if you don't see it, hit me up, let me know.